All right, let's now get into the first world conversation. It's a elicited debate, as you can see already. And just remind you, we are joined by Ambassador Dr. Josephine Ojiambo, as well as Johnson Nderi. I'll start with you, Johnson. What is this fascination over the Asian tigers? As I understand it, we're talking Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. He mentioned Malaysia, but I'm not so sure. Are they Asian tigers?
Yeah, so certainly Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea are stellar examples. And I think the most important one, at least in my view, is Hong Kong, which also inspired Singapore. Hong Kong and Singapore, in fact, they call it the Hong Kong miracle. So in 1960s, when Sir John Cowperthwaite took the, he was a Treasury Secretary. They were sort of taking aid from UK. By 1970, they were giving aid to UK. So that was an inspiration to Singapore, which also had similar start. And they adopted some of the policies with a twist. In fact, Lee Kuan Yew, who was leading the charge, always said that he envied how he wished he could do exactly as Hong Kong did, but because his people were demanding of state support, he had to, do it with a twist in the least economic destructive way. But if you look at the two, since inception, Hong Kong and Singapore have been one of the most free economies. They always thought that the entrepreneur is a guy who is going to drive their development, as opposed to what we are seeing now, where government is saying its spending is where it's going to drive its development. The inspiration from Hong Kong and Singapore comes from Adam Smith, but we look to have taken a very Keynesian approach to economic development.
Okay, hiyo hapo Keynesian kidogo umenipoteza, but I'll ask.
In good time I can explain, but it's fine.
All right, but Ambassador, I'll ask you to come in at this point. Okay, so President Ruto says his agenda is pegged on, building transport and logistics, human capital. I think in Singapore that they did quite, the little I read is that they did quite well there. And then net export and energy, right? But we have Vision 2030. Prior to President William Ruto coming in, we had the Big Four agenda. So, why haven't we fully realized these other plans already?
Okay, so those agenda, let's take a step back first and look at the larger landscape. Kenya is doing well. We could do better. So what happened with those wonderful plans, Vision 2030, to be a middle-income country by 2030, and the Big Four agenda? And you've mentioned, affordable housing, healthcare, manufacturing, which we need to talk a little bit more about, and industry and food security. I think he's mentioned a little bit the issue of public debt, using government revenue to finance programs. That's something that really continues to spiral out of control. And so this large public debt causes less flexibility in terms of spending for the government in social programs and also to finance infrastructure. So we can't grow our infrastructure like those countries did, or even be flexible with social goods to our populations. Another one which everybody will speak about if we don't hear, the issue of corruption and the mismanagement of resources. These undermine trust. And when they do, getting the whole population on board, like was done in Singapore and in Hong Kong, becomes difficult. So the undermining of public trust, another thing. And then because corruption redirects funding, it can't go to social programs, and that again sets us back. But then also our economy is vulnerable, and vulnerable to global economic shocks. We all remember the downturn after COVID-19, after the Ukraine, or as a result of Ukraine and others. And these are things that have made those programs really not as successful, because even with these global shocks, then commodity prices go up. And the common man now feels a disincentive towards the collective good of his country. So those are the things that I'd say really have caused those programs not to take off the way that they were intended to. Although I do say we are making progress.
Mm-hmm. We are making progress. But let me ask you, your thoughts on how President William Ruto wants to drive this agenda, because something you've raised, the question of borrowing, and so he says, you know, we've been relying on borrowing and tax revenue to fund development. But he talked about the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund, the utilization of a national infrastructure fund. What do you make of that as what he says is the primary way to drive this 5 trillion shilling agenda?
To be honest, I think it's Hocus Pocus.
Wow.
Reason being, we already have a lot of government investment companies already. We've got Kenya Development Corporation, we've got Kenya Development Bank. Now we also have East African Development Bank and Africa Development Bank, where we are all shareholders, and a host of other what do you call them, supranational organizations that we are participating in that could have and have been doing a lot of this work for us. Some of the roads we have that have been done here have been done by African Development Bank, EADB, and whatever. My thinking is, first of all, do we need the infrastructure? You know, when you look at these other countries, Hong Kong and Singapore, for example, you develop, then use the development to finance the infrastructure. It's not vice versa. Yes, you still need the infrastructure, but you've got to find a way to pay for it. As we're speaking now, we've got a couple of infrastructure that are yet to even turn to pay for themselves. We've got the port in Lamu. I mean, it's receiving the tens of, maybe even hundreds of billions of spent there. SGR is still a problem, and SGR took hundreds of billions in investments, and it's still, even from an operational perspective, still demanding additional revenues, additional government support over and above the revenues it's collecting. So I'm not convinced that infrastructure spend will grow this economy. I don't think that's the issue. What needs to grow the economy is investment in the private sector, into factories, and create jobs and improve productivity. Our savings rates are too low to support the productivity growth that we are imagining we are pursuing, because that's the only way. So it's the savings that finance the investments that generate the productivity growth. And without the productivity growth, I mean, I was just watching Toyota and the factories, I mean, how they're able to produce hundreds of cars per day. That's the kind of productivity growth we're talking about. We're not talking about getting from point A to point B faster. Yeah. So until we get investments in the private sector into manufacturing, create jobs, and everybody's participating in production, and then we've got investments supporting growth in productivity, I don't see a path towards Singapore. In fact, what I'm seeing is a debt crisis that, if it's not already here, it's coming.
Mm. I feel like we're already in a debt crisis, although the president talked about how he, in the last 2 years, has pulled Kenya from the brink, economically speaking.
When you look at the numbers, they don't support that. We are still taking too much of our tax revenues to debt service. So it's, and that's growing. So until that growth reverses, we can't say we're out of the woods.
All right. So, Ambassador, a big part, several times during his speech in the State of the Nation address, the president addressed the cynicism. And, you know, he said, essentially, facts are stubborn and the facts are on his side. How important is it, in your view, for him to get the nation on side, for us to realize what this vision of his?
It's important for the nation to be on side, and that's a responsibility of all of us, because after all, Kenya belongs to each one. And there are facts there that show that there has been growth, there has been improvement. We're talking now about simple things like our inflation rates coming down. Foreign reserves have peaked. Right now they're at all-time high, never been that high since independence, am I not right? So some of these facts and others, like the coverage of community health workers in the rural area, need to go out so that the common person understands that they are actually part of the overall national agenda. And that's what Lee Kuan Yew did. He was able to mobilize a nation around his social development plan, and so did Park Chung-lee. And as a result, because they're able to bring on board young people and others, they were able to move their countries forward along their development plan. But then there are things that we must step away from. I think they did very well because, yes, we come from the same colonial heritage, but they stepped out of some of the things that have held us back. The issues of political instability, ethnic mobilization, and we've mentioned it, corruption and mismanagement. But also, they went forward on the issues of primary commodities and moving into value addition, so that where we're growing tea and coffee and cotton and pyrethrum and other things, we are able to export greater value, and therefore we are not so vulnerable to global downturns in finance. So there are things that they did that, because of the leadership's vision, were able to drive their country forward. So I come back and say it's important. Everybody must be on board, but getting on board is a national program. Now, what did they do? They also invested in education of their people, in primary, in secondary, in tertiary education. We've been doing well, but we're still lagging behind. They had export policies that were oriented to driving growth and getting people to work because of exporting their value addition commodities. We haven't gotten there. We started off post-independence having more import subsidy and looking at supporting local manufacturing, local produce in a way where government protected farmers and protected industry. And as a result, yes, they grew, but again, public debt continued to grow. So there are things that they did which we can do and are beginning to do that will help us grow. And indeed, we've spoken here a little bit about the National Infrastructure Fund.
Yeah.
I think the thing about it is that it brings on board private sector. So this is an initiative that our president has spoken about that will indeed bring the additional private sector funding we require to fast-track development. It will also, if well implemented, ring-fence privatization money and put it back into the economy, something that people are always asking about, and maybe you want to comment on that. And also the other fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, again, another innovation in funding economic growth, importantly looks at natural resources. We're not going outside our country. We're doing things that we can do. We're improving our natural resources. So these are things that we need to focus a little bit more on so that we can bring on board the whole of Kenya.
All right. Mm-hmm. You know, your last word in response to some of what the ambassador has said. What can we emulate? What can we take away from these Asian tigers?
So, first of all, let me just point out that in infrastructure spending, there is already a lot of private sector participation. If you look at our energy sector, a lot of our energy, yes, KenGen is still the primary producer, and it's 70% government owned. But if you look at, since 2006, issued sold shares listed on the stock market, issued a bond, and that bond was used to finance some of the energy investment that has gone into that. Safaricom listed, it's a fantastic example of private sector involvement or even investment into our infrastructure. So I think they're already you know, strong private sector participation. But when it comes to investment, and you know, I always tell people jobs are created when investors and entrepreneurs come together. We need to give them the space to do that. And one thing Hong Kong and Singapore, South Korea, Japan have done very well is keep the tax rates low, because that's what allows private sector to retain resources and invest and reinvest, and that's the investment and reinvestment is where the growth comes from.
All right. And lastly from you, Ambassador, do we have reason to be optimistic that we can turn around Kenya's economic fortunes in a lifetime?
I think we have reasons to be optimistic because the Asian tigers did. We come from a background that's similar. At independence, we had, what was it, $100 to $200 as our GDP per capita. And also, we have, if I might say, regional interests. We have the Indian Ocean, where we've been trading from time immemorial. And I think that we're able now, because we have leadership that is well-intentioned, to say that we can, together with the people of Kenya, move forward, which is what they had. I think we hear speaking a lot more now about Lee Kuan Yew and a lot more now about Park. So with that, I think in one generation, as we have been told, we can see progress. I also want to reiterate, we should try and always reach for the stars. If you fall a little lower, we'll be above mediocrity. So having a goal out there is very important, and we should be able to inspire our population to live towards a goal and not inspire negativity or lack of hope or underdevelopment. Let's inspire a vision ahead. And so I want to say, I think it's possible. It's been done elsewhere. There's no reason why we can't. Kenya has some of the most, I must say, vibrant young people. We have a population that's now very driven towards accountability and growth. We have a civil society that participates. I think with this investment fund, we can attract private sector that may have slipped away from us. I think that's a way forward. I believe it's possible.
All right. I want to thank you both for being here tonight and at least setting the stage for this conversation moving forward, because I anticipate it will continue. We have had in studio Ambassador Dr. Josephine Ojiambo, who is the former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth, also formerly Kenya's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. We've also had on set Johnson Derry, who is a corporate finance consultant. Thank you for staying with us. And we have more coming up on the other side of this break. Here's just a little bit of what you can expect.